Today I'm going to talk about the difference between primary, secondary, and opportunistic infections. So we're starting with primary infections. Primary infections are the first or initial infection that someone has. It's just you get sick out of nowhere, that's your primary infection. These infections are caused by pathogens that can infect anyone, regardless of your health status. Even if you're super healthy, everything in you is perfect, you get the first infection, that's your primary infection. There's so many different examples of primary infections, but just a few is influenza, for example. So the flu, we've all had the flu. It's caused by the influenza virus, and all of us can get the flu. Another example is a common cold, which is caused by a different type of virus. They're caused by rhinoviruses typically, and we can all have a cold. So if you have a flu or cold out of nowhere, that's your primary or initial infection. Another example is strep throat. Strep throat is caused by Streptococcus bacteria. Any of us can get strep throat if exposed to the bacteria. There's urinary tract infections, so many. So with the pathogenesis of a primary infection begins when a pathogen enters someone's body, sticks to your host cells, and starts making copies of itself. And so when a pathogen enters your body in a perfect world for most of us turns on your immune system or your immune response. You see inflammation, your white blood cells go up, and this takes a lot of energy. So all your energy is going to your immune system. So that's why you feel tired when you're sick. And that's why you're also more prone to other infections, which we call secondary infections, because all your energy is going to protect you from the primary infection. So if you don't take care of yourself, actually, even if you do, it can happen to anyone. A secondary infection can happen. A secondary infection happens during or after treatment for a primary infection. They can result from the initial infection or the treatment, which can weaken your immune system. So for example, a common one I could think of is, let's say your primary infection, your first infection is you have a cold or a flu, and then a few days later, you have an ear infection. The ear infection is a secondary infection. So this can happen after a cold. So you have tubes here that can become blocked due to inflammation from the initial infection, and this allows bacteria to grow and cause a completely different ear infection. Another example of a secondary infection is a skin infection. So someone can have some sort of primary infection that causes them to itch their skin a lot, and then Staphylococcus bacteria can get in and cause a skin infection. So that's secondary infection. Secondary infections, again, typically happen because there's a primary infection and it's weakening someone's body and they're more likely to catch other things. A lot of times also people will have a primary infection and then later they will see cold sores. They'll see cold sores, and the cold sores can be a secondary infection. So that's a secondary infection. That's why it's very important to not go out when you're sick, to protect yourself, because you're more likely to catch multiple secondary infections when you're already sick. You have a primary infection. Next, we have opportunistic infection. Opportunistic infections are caused by pathogens that take advantage or opportunity of a weakened immune system or someone who's immunocompromised. That means that your immune system is compromised, it's weakened. So that can be people who have HIV/AIDS. It can be cancer patients who are undergoing chemotherapy. Both cancer and chemotherapy weaken your immune system. You can also be taking various drugs that naturally weaken your immune system. For example, steroids are given for multiple conditions, but they also weaken your immune system, so you're more likely to catch other infections when you're taking steroids. So an example of an opportunistic infection is a fungal yeast infection, which happens a lot to people with weakened immune systems, or sometimes people who are taking chemotherapy or people who have diabetes. We can also see an example of an opportunistic infection is a lung mold infection like aspergillosis. So mold spores are everywhere. Sometimes an opportunistic infection is when an immunocompromised person breathes in those mold spores and they cause a bad lung infection that they wouldn't otherwise cause in someone who's healthy. So opportunistic pathogens are usually present in the environment everywhere as part of our normal microbiota, but they don't cause disease in healthy individuals. When an immune system is weakened, these pathogens can overgrow and cause infection. To clarify, there is a small difference between secondary and opportunistic infections. They're very similar, but there's a small difference. So secondary infections are infections that occur after an initial primary infection. They can occur in anyone, and they are basically happen because someone had a recent primary infection. So for example, bacterial pneumonia is a common one. So maybe a healthy person had the flu or a cold, and then a few days later they have pneumonia. Pneumonia would be a secondary infection. So it follows a primary infection. Now, opportunistic infections occur in people with a weakened immune system, and that can be due to multiple things, not just a primary infection. It can be due to maybe a genetic disease someone has, just a disease they have in general, a cancer patient, someone who takes drugs, someone who's had an organ transplant. So that's the difference between primary, secondary, and opportunistic infection. And the final thing I want to say is when a doctor comes in a room and they say, what was the primary infection? It means what was the first infection they had? And then they can ask you, is this a secondary infection? So if out of nowhere your ear hurts, that's a primary infection. But if your ear hurts and then you remember a week before you had a flu, that's a secondary infection. And you can have multiple secondary infections. So we call everything after the primary infection a secondary infection.